In a quiet suburb, a tragedy occurred. A young mother of 2 children was found dead in her home, under mysterious circumstances. The police began an investigation to determine the cause of her death. Initially, they discovered several alarming clues, including signs of a struggle and unclear fingerprints. Further investigation revealed that the case was much more complicated than it first appeared, with many unexpected twists and hidden connections. Kathy Odom was born on October 25, 1959, in a small town near Houston, Texas. She grew up in a close-knit and loving family. Her parents, James and Mary, always supported her in all her endeavors. James worked as an engineer, and Mary was a school teacher. Kathy was the eldest child in the family and had 2 younger brothers, Michael and Stephen. In addition to her 2 younger brothers, Michael and Stephen, Kathy had a younger sister named Sarah. The sisters were very close from childhood and always supported each other. Sarah, being a few years younger than Kathy, always looked up to her as a role model. Kathy helped Sarah with her studies, supported her interests, and shared her hobbies. Together, they spent a lot of time engaging in sports, arts, and simply enjoying each other's company. Kathy's childhood was filled with warmth and care. She grew up in an atmosphere of mutual support and love. At school, she was active, participating in sports and arts, and always found time for friends and family. Her parents taught her responsibility and respect for others, which was reflected in her desire to help people and engage in charity work. In high school, Kathy met a boy named Mike Odom. They quickly bonded over shared interests and views on life. Their romance developed rapidly, and a few years after graduation they got married. The couple decided to settle in a quiet suburb of Houston, aiming to create a cozy home for their future family. After the wedding, their life was filled with happy events. Soon they had a daughter, whom they named Tasha. Kathy, becoming a mother, found her true calling in caring for her child. Mike supported her in everything, working at a small sign manufacturing company owned by Kathy's father. The job was stable and provided enough income for the family to live without worries. 3 years later, at the beginning of 1987, Kathy became pregnant again. This time they were expecting a boy. In January of that year, at the age of 27, Kathy gave birth to a son, whom they named Sean. With the birth of her second child, Kathy fully devoted herself to her family. She spent most of her time at home, surrounding her children with care and love. Despite his busy work schedule, Mike always tried to spend his free time with his family, supporting Kathy in all her endeavors. The family's financial situation was good, thanks to Mike's job and the support of Kathy's parents. They often visited to help with the children, allowing Kathy to rest and take some time for herself. Kathy was happy in her role as a mother and wife. She organized family picnics, participated in school events, and was always there when her children needed her. Their home was always filled with laughter, joy, and love. Kathy was an inspiration to everyone who knew her, and her family was the most important thing in her life. Despite daily concerns and difficulties, Kathy and Mike were confident about the future and believed that together they could overcome any trials. Their story was an example of true family love and dedication, and every day they tried to make their lives and the lives of their children a little better and happier. March 3, 1987, was an ordinary day for Kathy. She was at home with the children, going about her daily chores and caring for her family while Mike was at work. That day, Mike decided to relax after work and spend some time with friends in the city. Before that, he tried to call Kathy on the home phone to inform her of his plans and check how things were going at home. However, to his surprise, no one picked up the phone. This was unusual, as Kathy always tried to stay in touch, especially when she was home with the children. Mike called several times, but there was still no answer. His concern grew. Kathy hardly ever left the house, especially on weekdays when all her energy was focused on the children and household duties. Mike decided that something might have happened and called their neighbor Tim, asking him to check if everything was okay. Tim was a good neighbor, always ready to help. He immediately headed to Kathy and Mike's house. Upon reaching the door, he knocked but received no response. After knocking several more times and hearing no sounds from inside, he looked through the living room window. The lights were on, and the TV was on, which made the silence inside the house even more alarming. The neighbor kept knocking, but to no avail. Tim began to worry that something serious might have happened to Kathy. Anxious, he decided to act. Instead of returning home to call Mike or the police, he quickly got into his car and drove into the city, hoping to find patrolling officers who could help in this situation. After driving several kilometers in search of help, Tim finally spotted a police car patrolling the area. He abruptly stopped, jumped out of his car, and barely catching his breath, explained the situation to the officers. The police immediately decided to go to Kathy's house with Tim. Upon arriving at the house, they knocked again, but there was still no answer. The officers then tried to open the door, and to their surprise, it was unlocked. Carefully entering inside, they immediately noticed the strange silence and tense atmosphere. In the living room, on the couch, they found Kathy's daughter, Tasha. She was unconscious, and there were visible signs of beatings on her body, causing immediate alarm among the officers. They promptly called for an ambulance and continued inspecting the house, realizing that the situation was far more serious than it initially seemed. In the bedroom, the police found Kathy's son, Sean, who was peacefully sleeping in his crib. He was fine and unaware of what was happening around him. The officers, relieved that the boy was safe, proceeded to inspect the other rooms. However, in one of them, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. Kathy lay on the floor, covered in blood. She was completely naked, and her hands were tied with a lamp cord. The police quickly established that she was already dead. The medics who arrived at the scene immediately attended to Kathy's daughter and urgently took her to the hospital. Meanwhile, investigators began a detailed examination of the crime scene, trying to find any clues that could shed light on what had happened. Shortly thereafter, Kathy's father, James, arrived at the house. The police, understanding the tragedy of the situation, decided not to tell him all the horrific details on the spot. They asked him to go to the hospital to be with his granddaughter when she regained consciousness. James, in shock and concerned about Tasha's condition, immediately went to the hospital. Waiting in the reception area, he tried to cope with the overwhelming emotions and prayed for his granddaughter's health. At that moment, a news segment started airing on the TV in the reception area. Kathy's father was horrified to hear what had happened at his daughter's house. The news anchor reported that a young woman had been found dead in a Houston suburb, and her daughter had been hospitalized with serious injuries. This was how he learned about Kathy's death, which was a devastating blow for him. Meanwhile, Mike arrived at the house, and his appearance immediately caught the attention of the police. At first glance, his return home significantly later than the discovery of the crime aroused suspicion. Additionally, the police were alarmed by several stains on his shirt that resembled blood. The officers immediately asked Mike to hand over his clothes for further examination and offered to answer their questions. While Mike was being interrogated, investigators continued to examine the crime scene and made several important discoveries. First, they found many traces of blood in the bathroom. It seemed the perpetrator had tried to clean up the crime scene, indicating that they spent some time in the house rather than leaving immediately after committing the crime. This led investigators to believe that the perpetrator knew they had time to attempt to cover their tracks. Second, the forensic experts found no signs of forced entry. All windows and doors, except for the front door, were locked. This indicated two possible scenarios. Either Kathy had let the perpetrator into the house herself, or the perpetrator had a key. The police began to consider who might have had access to the keys, or was close enough to Kathy or her family that she would open the door for them. The discovery of the victim's clothing also drew the detectives' attention. All of Kathy's clothes were neatly folded on the floor next to her body. This indicated possible sexual assault, but the detectives found it strange that the perpetrator had folded her clothes so neatly. They hypothesized that the attacker might have threatened to harm Kathy's daughter if she screamed or resisted. In fear for her daughter, Kathy might have complied with his demands, explaining the order of her actions. However, after that, the perpetrator killed her anyway. Meanwhile, doctors were fighting for the life of Kathy's daughter, Tasha, who had been urgently taken to the hospital. A medical examination showed that the girl had received numerous blows, most likely with fists, indicating the brutality of the attack. The doctors did everything possible to stabilize her condition and save her life. After several hours in the hospital, Tasha's condition worsened and she fell into a coma. The chances of her survival remained low, intensifying the tragic nature of the situation. Medical experts, carefully examining Kathy's body, determined that she had received 16 stab wounds, most of which were in the abdomen. They also confirmed that the victim had been assaulted and extracted biological material belonging to the perpetrator. However, in those years, DNA analysis was not widely available and was rarely used in forensics. Instead, experts could only determine the blood type of the perpetrator, which, despite its limitations, could still provide important clues. The biological material was sent to a lab for further analysis. From the beginning of the investigation, the police began to closely scrutinize the victim's husband, Mike. The strange stains on his shirt raised suspicions, and the investigators immediately seized his clothes for analysis. Mike's behavior that evening also seemed odd to them. After work, he decided to spend time with friends, which in itself was not suspicious. However, when Kathy did not answer his calls, instead of going home to check personally, he asked his neighbor Tim to check if everything was okay. To the detectives, this looked like a possible attempt to create an alibi. In their experience, they had often encountered such tactics, where the husband would commit the murder and then create an alibi, for example, by going to a bar with friends. Then he would ask someone else to check on his wife, so he wouldn't be the one to find the body, which would further divert suspicion from him. The police began to check if Mike could have had the opportunity to commit this crime and then go meet his friends. Soon the detectives discovered something else. It turned out that Mike had a criminal past. After graduating from high school, he was arrested for selling illegal substances to an undercover police officer. This fact added new details to his profile and intensified suspicions against him. Carefully examining his past, investigators tried to understand if Mike was capable of such a brutal crime. In his youth, the man was sentenced to 6 years in prison for selling illegal substances. But he served only 2 years, being released early for good behavior. Sometime later, he met and eventually married Kathy. Despite his criminal past, the police needed much more evidence to charge him with murder. They also decided to check the neighbor Tim, to whom Mike had called that fateful evening, as his behavior also seemed strange. Instead of calling the police from his home, Tim got in his car and started driving around the city looking for patrol officers. This seemed very unusual and suspicious to the detectives. They searched his car and found stains on the floor mats that resembled blood. These clues were also sent to the lab for analysis. Investigators began considering the possibility that Mike and Tim might have been accomplices, or that the crime was committed by one of them. Meanwhile, medical experts completed their report and reached an important conclusion. They established that Kathy died around 1 p.m., about 6 hours before she was discovered. This meant the detectives had to figure out where the suspects were and what they were doing long before the evening. Mike and Tim insisted that both were at work, so the police began verifying their alibis. At the same time, 2 days after the murder, an unexpected call came from the hospital. Tasha suddenly came out of the coma. Her life was no longer in danger, and the investigators went to her, hoping that the girl could shed light on what had happened. However, they quickly faced a problem. The girl, who was only 4 years old at the time, had almost completely lost her memory of the events. The only thing she could remember was that a man with blonde hair had entered their house. This fragment of information led the detectives to new considerations. They began looking for connections between all the figures in the case, checking not only Mike and Tim but also potential third parties who might fit the girl's description. Both her father and Tim had dark hair, but the detectives did not rush to rule them out as suspects. They hypothesized that the girl's memory might be inaccurate due to severe trauma and psychological shock. Contacting psychologists, the detectives asked them to work with the girl, hoping that she could recall more details about the perpetrator. Soon the detectives received a call from the lab, and here came another unexpected twist. The experts, after examining the evidence, established that the stains on the neighbor's car mats were from machine oil, and the stains on the husband's shirt turned out to be ordinary paint. But that was not all. Colleagues of both Mike and Tim confirmed that they were at their workplaces that day and did not leave until the evening. Thus, neither of the men had the physical opportunity to be in Kathy's house and commit the crime. Finally, the detectives suggested they take polygraph tests, and the results showed no deviations. The situation became even more confusing, and the police, who had been almost certain of one of their involvement, found themselves at a dead end. Finding themselves back at square one, the detectives began considering other possible suspects who were acquainted with the victim and could have easily entered her home. After talking to Kathy's relatives and friends, they tried to determine who might have committed this crime. To their surprise, many of them, without hesitation, named the same person, Greg Marquardt. Greg was the husband of Kathy's sister, Sarah, and her acquaintances mentioned that she had repeatedly complained about his behavior. Kathy had talked about his outbursts of aggression and suspicious behavior, which had caused her serious concern. Relatives recalled Kathy mentioning Greg's strange visits, where he would show up unannounced and often stay for long periods, even when it was inconvenient. According to Kathy, Greg did not hide his intentions and often openly flirted with her, repeatedly suggesting they engage in an intimate relationship. Moreover, Kathy mentioned that Greg frequently remarked inappropriately that he liked her abdomen. This was particularly alarming since most of the stab wounds were inflicted in that area. The police also discovered that Greg regularly used heavy illegal substances and had a criminal history. The detectives began closely monitoring Greg and soon received their first significant lead. Forensic experts found a fingerprint in Kathy's house that matched Greg's prints, as well as a hair resembling his. However, there was a problem. Given that Greg often visited Kathy and her husband, the fingerprint and hair could have been left there before the murder. Kathy's parents firmly believed that Greg was guilty of this heinous crime. Kathy's mother also shared an interesting observation. While she was in the hospital with her granddaughter, Greg visited them in the middle of the night. As soon as the girl saw him, she immediately became frightened and looked at her grandmother with a horrified expression. After Greg left, the grandmother asked her granddaughter if he was the man who had come to their house. The girl said she still couldn't remember anything, but her reaction made the grandmother suspect that Greg might be involved. The detectives continued the investigation, trying to gather more evidence against Greg. They spoke with his neighbors and acquaintances, trying to find out if they had noticed anything unusual in his behavior. Some of them said that Greg was quite reclusive and rarely interacted with others, but recently they had seen him more nervous and irritable than usual. After hearing all the testimonies, the detectives invited Greg for questioning. He categorically denied any involvement in the murder and claimed that he was with his friend, who also had a significant criminal history at the time. In the middle of the interrogation, Greg suddenly said he needed to go to the parking lot to pay for extra time, otherwise he would get a fine. However, the man never returned to the station. His wife, Sarah, reported that on that day, Greg drove her to work around 10:30 a.m. and picked her up at 2:30 p.m. This gave him a 4-hour window, coinciding with the time of the murder, allowing him to attack Kathy. But despite this, the police did not have strong evidence to prove his involvement. The detectives decided to analyze the semen sample taken from the victim's body. At that time, experts could only determine the blood type, and to their surprise, the sample's blood type matched Greg's. However, this result was not sufficient to prove his guilt, and the investigators could not charge him with the crime. The police continued to search for other evidence, but proving Greg's guilt was challenging. The case was practically at a standstill. Kathy's family was convinced that Greg was the murderer, but they could do nothing. Sarah refused to believe in her husband's involvement and continued to live with him. In the following years, the detectives periodically reopened the investigation but could not arrest Greg. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, the detectives decided to request a DNA analysis of the remaining semen sample. During this time, technology had significantly advanced, and DNA analysis had become a standard procedure in forensics. However, they encountered a setback. The experts were able to extract only a partial profile of the semen owner. This profile was compared with Greg's DNA sample, which had been stored in the lab since the first months of the investigation. The result was inconclusive. All the experts could determine was that Greg fell into the 2% of the world's population who could match this partial profile. Naturally, the detectives couldn't arrest him based on this result, but they still tried to get a confession from him. Greg was invited for questioning, where they claimed that the semen from the victim's body matched his DNA. To the detective's surprise, the man changed his initial statement and claimed that he actually had an affair with Kathy. He said that he had visited her that morning and they had consensual intercourse. The man added that after that he left and Kathy was alive when he left the house. Of course, the detectives were not quick to believe him. Firstly, such a change in the story was very common in murder cases. A significant percentage of criminals start claiming they had an affair with the victim as soon as they hear about a DNA match. Secondly, Kathy had repeatedly complained that Greg had propositioned her for sex. She said that he scared her with his behavior and tried to stay away from him. Despite this, the detectives understood that without a full DNA match, they couldn't hold Greg accountable. The local prosecutor reviewed the case and confirmed that it would be impossible to secure a conviction, and the case again stalled for several years. In 2002, the detectives reopened the investigation and decided to seek help from forensic expert Kathryn Long, who at the time was conducting rather unusual DNA-related research. They and their colleagues wanted to understand if genetic material from the perpetrator's hands could remain on the victim's body after strangulation, and whether it could be extracted for analysis. To test this, Kathryn and her colleagues simulated strangulation by squeezing each other's necks, and then took biological samples from these areas and from their hands. The results were quite interesting. They found that even brief hand compression on the neck left enough skin particles to be used for DNA analysis. The detectives in Kathy's case were intrigued by their work. The investigators began reviewing all the existing evidence to determine if the perpetrator might have touched any objects in the house. Soon their attention turned to the lamp cord used to bind the victim's hands. The detectives immediately sent the cord for reanalysis, hoping to find traces of the perpetrator's DNA on it. Forensic experts conducted a thorough examination and, to their surprise, found a small amount of genetic material. This material was analyzed, and the results showed a complete match with Greg's DNA. Now the detectives had irrefutable evidence of his guilt. With new evidence in hand, 15 years after the murder, the investigators arrested Greg and charged him. During the interrogation, Greg vehemently denied his guilt, insisting that he and Kathy had an affair. The detectives did not believe his words and, possessing DNA evidence, decided to take the case to court. While awaiting trial, Greg was placed in pre-trial detention. After some time, the detectives learned something interesting. Greg's cellmate contacted them, claiming that Greg had confessed to the murder. According to the cellmate, Greg not only confessed to the murder but also boasted about it. He detailed how he raped and killed his wife's sister. On that day, Greg said, he took powerful illegal substances and went to Kathy's house. Once inside, he began to harass her, but she pushed him away and demanded he leave. Enraged, Greg approached her daughter and delivered several heavy blows to her. Then, threatening to kill the child, he forced Kathy to comply with his demands. He tied her hands, raped her, and then killed her by inflicting multiple stab wounds. Afterward, he washed the blood off himself in the bathroom and changed into her husband's clothes to avoid leaving blood traces in his car. The detectives had no doubt about the truthfulness of the cellmate's words, as he could not have known so many key details even if he had read about the case in the news. Armed with his testimony, the detectives summoned Greg for another interrogation. Under the weight of the presented evidence and the detailed testimony of his cellmate, Greg broke down. He confessed that he had indeed killed Kathy and repeated everything he had previously told his cellmate. In 2004, Greg Marquardt went to trial and pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in prison. Despite the harsh sentence, Greg spent only 4 years behind bars. At the age of 56, he died of liver cancer. It seemed fate continued to test Kathy's family. Her husband, Mike, did not live to see the arrest of the killer, dying at the age of 45. For Kathy's children and parents, the last 15 years were full of torment and uncertainty. They always suspected Greg was the murderer, but had to watch him continue to live with their other daughter without being able to change anything. After the long investigation concluded and justice was served, Kathy's family expressed deep gratitude to the detectives who did not give up on the case, despite all the difficulties and years that had passed. It was incredibly hard for them to see the person they believed was guilty of the murder living freely. Sarah could not believe for a long time that her husband was capable of such brutality, and the news was a devastating blow for her. Following Greg's arrest and confession, Kathy's family, despite all the horrors they had endured, began to slowly recover. The children grew up surrounded by the care and love of their grandparents. Kathy's parents finally found some peace, knowing that justice had been served and that the guilty party had been punished, albeit not fully. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes of Detective Investigations. Thanks for watching.